In the past decade, the richest economies on Earth have absorbed tens of millions of new people. Borders opened wider. Visas multiplied. Planes landed every hour, carrying workers, students, families, refugees. Population rose. GDP rose. Employment numbers looked strong on paper. And yet, across those same countries, something else was breaking. Young adults delayed having children because they could not afford space. Rent climbed faster than wages. Commutes grew longer. Hospitals became more crowded. Anger crept into politics. How did a policy meant to fuel growth end up deepening frustration? How did economies that added millions of workers still feel short of opportunity? And why do governments keep pulling the same lever, even as the social cost rises? To understand what is happening now, we need to step back. Not to a single country, but to a structural problem shared by almost every advanced economy. For decades after World War II, growth in rich countries followed a simple formula. Productivity rose, wages followed, populations were young, each generation was larger than the one before it. Governments built welfare states assuming tomorrow would always have more workers than today. That assumption quietly collapsed. By the early 2000s, fertility rates across the developed world had fallen below replacement level. Japan was first. Europe followed, then South Korea, then parts of North America. Societies were aging faster than their institutions could adapt. Fewer workers were expected to support more retirees, more healthcare spending, more public debt. This created a political nightmare. Raising retirement ages angered voters. Cutting benefits was electoral suicide. Increasing taxes risked slowing already fragile growth. So governments reached for a solution that looked painless in the short term: immigration. In theory, immigration solves multiple problems at once. New workers pay taxes, they fill labor shortages, they slow population decline, they keep pension systems afloat. On spreadsheets inside finance ministries, the numbers often look compelling. In practice, however, economies are not spreadsheets. Between 2010 and the early 2020s, global migration reached levels not seen in modern history. According to the United Nations, the number of international migrants surpassed 280 million. A growing share headed toward a small cluster of rich countries. The United States experienced some of the highest net migration in its history. Canada recorded population growth rates unseen since the 1950s. Several European countries absorbed waves of migrants and refugees within just a few years. Australia expanded skilled and temporary migration programs aggressively. From a distance, this looked like demographic renewal. From inside these societies, the experience felt very different. Housing was the first fault line. Homes are not built overnight. Land use regulations, zoning laws, financing constraints, and local opposition make housing one of the slowest systems to adjust. When population growth accelerates suddenly, supply almost always lags. In Canada, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Over a short span of time, population growth surged while housing completions barely moved. In some years, population increased several times faster than new housing stock. The result was predictable. Rents climbed at double-digit rates, home prices surged far beyond incomes, and young households were locked out. The United Kingdom faced a similar squeeze. London continued to attract global capital and global labor, but housing construction lagged for decades. The city accumulated extraordinary wealth at the top, while pushing essential workers farther from the center. Commutes lengthened, social tension grew. In the United States, the story varied by city, but the pattern repeated. Metropolitan areas that attracted migrants and job growth often failed to reform zoning laws. Supply remained constrained, prices rose. Even regions with ample land found themselves bottlenecked by infrastructure and local politics. Housing did not just become expensive. It became a source of quiet resentment. Longtime residents felt displaced. Newcomers struggled to gain stability. Both groups competed for a limited number of units, while owners benefited from rising asset values. Labor markets formed the second fault line. Migration undeniably expands the workforce, but where and how that workforce is absorbed matters. Many migrants enter sectors already under wage pressure: construction, logistics, food service, care work, retail. In theory, more workers should mean more output. In reality, it often means intensified competition at the bottom. In the United States, headline employment numbers remained strong throughout much of the 2010s and early 2020s. Yet real wage growth for lower-income workers lagged behind housing and healthcare costs. Productivity gains flowed upward, while labor supply expanded downward. For employers, this created flexibility. For workers, it created precarity. This is not a story of migrants stealing jobs. It is a story of bargaining power. When labor supply grows faster than demand in specific sectors, wages stagnate. When housing costs rise at the same time, living standards erode even if employment remains high. Europe experienced a similar dynamic, layered with political complexity. Countries like Germany and Sweden absorbed large numbers of refugees in short periods. Integration took time. Training systems strained. Local services struggled to adapt. While long-term economic effects remain debated, short-term pressures were felt immediately in housing, education, and municipal budgets. Then there is the fiscal paradox. Immigration is often justified as a way to stabilize public finances. Migrants tend to be younger, they pay taxes, they delay the fiscal crunch of aging societies. All of this is true in aggregate, but budgets are not managed in aggregate. They are managed locally. Schools, hospitals, transportation systems, and housing assistance programs operate at the city and regional level. When populations rise quickly, costs appear immediately. Tax contributions arrive gradually. This mismatch creates fiscal stress where people actually live. Municipalities expand classrooms before income taxes materialize. Hospitals treat patients before payroll contributions accumulate. Transit systems absorb demand before funding catches up. National governments may benefit over decades, while local governments struggle year to year. This gap feeds political backlash. Across many advanced economies, public trust eroded not because people rejected diversity, but because systems felt overwhelmed. Waiting times grew, rents spiked, infrastructure aged faster than it was replaced. Citizens were told the economy was growing, yet their daily experience contradicted the narrative. Politics responded. In Europe, parties once considered fringe gained traction by linking migration to cost of living pressures. In North America, debates over borders became proxies for deeper anxieties about affordability and social cohesion. Elections increasingly revolved around identity, even when the underlying issue was structural economics. At the center of all this sits a hard truth. Immigration has been used to compensate for failures elsewhere. Productivity growth slowed across the developed world long before migration surged. Investment in automation, training, and innovation often lagged. Housing policy ossified. Infrastructure investment underperformed. Political systems avoided reforms that imposed short-term pain. Instead of fixing these issues, many governments chose population growth as a substitute for productivity growth. More workers instead of better systems. More consumers instead of higher wages. For a time, this worked. GDP expanded, debt ratios stabilized, corporate profits held up. But beneath the surface, pressure accumulated. Japan offers a revealing counterpoint. Faced with the same demographic collapse as the West, Japan chose a different path. Immigration remained limited. Labor shortages were addressed through automation, robotics, and process efficiency. Productivity gains were uneven, and the economy stagnated in some respects, but housing remained relatively affordable. Social cohesion held, inequality rose more slowly. Japan paid a price, slower headline growth and mounting public debt, but it avoided the rapid urban crowding and housing inflation seen elsewhere. Its choice highlights a fundamental trade-off. There is no free solution to aging societies. Every path imposes costs. Immigration spreads those costs across housing, wages, and politics. Automation concentrates them in capital investment and slower consumption growth. Doing nothing concentrates them in fiscal collapse. The question is not whether migration is good or bad. The question is whether it is being paired with the reforms required to make it sustainable. So far, in many countries, it has not been. Housing supply remains constrained by outdated zoning laws. Infrastructure investment lags, population growth. Education and training systems fail to integrate workers efficiently. Productivity-enhancing reforms are postponed because population growth masks their absence. This creates a fragile equilibrium. Growth continues, but dissatisfaction rises. Economies expand, but trust contracts. Political systems become reactive rather than strategic. Looking ahead, the choices become starker. If migration continues at current levels without structural reform, housing affordability will deteriorate further. Political polarization will intensify. Social trust will erode. Growth may persist on paper, while legitimacy collapses in practice. If migration slows without productivity reform, labor shortages will worsen, fiscal pressures will accelerate, aging will bite harder. A third path exists, but it demands political courage. Align population policy with housing construction, match migration with infrastructure spending. Invest in productivity rather than masking its decline. Distribute the gains of growth more evenly. This is not a technical challenge. It is a governance challenge. At its core, the story of modern migration is not about borders. It is about systems. Systems that grew accustomed to easy solutions. Systems that postponed hard choices. Systems that now confront the limits of substitution. The migrant searching for opportunity and the young local unable to afford rent are not enemies. They are participants in the same experiment. An experiment where population growth replaced reform and where the bill is now coming due. The question facing advanced economies is no longer whether migration will continue. It almost certainly will. The real question is whether societies will finally fix the structures migration has been compensating for. Because if they do not, growth will keep rising, anger will keep spreading, and the promise of prosperity will continue to drift further out of reach for the people meant to benefit from it most. And history shows that when that gap grows too wide, systems eventually break, not quietly, but all at once. This necessitates a pivot toward what might be called the Great Rebalancing. For too long, the economic strategy of the West has relied on the hidden assumption that the supply of global labor is infinite. Policymakers have operated under the belief that no matter how expensive their cities become, there will always be a queue of willing workers at the border, ready to accept lower real wages for a shot at a better life. But this assumption is running on borrowed time. The demographic transition that emptied the cradles of Europe and East Asia is now spreading to the global South. Birth rates are plummeting in Latin America, India, and parts of the Middle East. The pool of mobile, working-age youth is not inexhaustible. As emerging economies develop and their own populations age, the desperate push factors driving migration will eventually soften, turning the current buyer's market for labor into a fierce global competition for talent. In that future, countries with broken housing markets and crumbling infrastructure will lose. Therefore, the only viable path forward forces advanced economies to confront the productivity crisis they have ignored. This is where the technological revolution, specifically in artificial intelligence and robotics, collides with demographic reality. For the past decade, cheap labor acted as a disincentive for capital investment. Why invest in expensive agricultural robotics or automated construction systems when low-wage immigrant labor is readily available? Why reform inefficient healthcare bureaucracy when you can simply import more nurses to plug the gaps? If migration creates a labor surplus at the bottom, it dampens the urge to innovate. The restriction of this easy growth lever, whether through political backlash or demographic reality, will finally force the hand of capital. We are likely to see a shift from labor-intensive growth to capital-intensive efficiency. This transition will be painful. It means that service sectors, restaurants, delivery, basic care, will become significantly more expensive as wages rise to reflect the true scarcity of labor. The era of cheap conveniences, subsidized by an underclass of precarious workers, may be coming to an end. But this inflation in the cost of services is the necessary price of a healthy society. High wages are a feature of a successful economy, not a bug. Ultimately, the metric of success must change. The obsession with aggregate GDP, the sheer size of the pie, has obscured the reality that the slices are getting thinner for the average citizen. A smaller or slower growing population, housed adequately and paid fairly, creates a more stable society than a booming population defined by tent cities and food banks. Governments must rewrite the social contract. This means zoning that prioritizes human habitation over asset appreciation. It means tax structures that reward work and innovation rather than land hoarding. It means accepting that a nation cannot be a gated community for the rich and a labor camp for the poor simultaneously. The warning lights are flashing across the developed world. The riots in Dublin, the populist surges in the Netherlands and Germany, and the polarization in the United States are not isolated events. They are tremors of a structural realignment. The choice is no longer between an open or closed world. The choice is between a managed transition to a high productivity, high wage equilibrium, or chaotic descent into social conflict where the economy grows, but the society collapses. The time for easy fixes is over. The time for building begins now.